Chapter 3: The Ego and its Family. Several important definitions. Before we continue Jung's journey into the depths of his unconscious, it is valuable to define some concepts which will be important for correct understanding of Jung's theories, but also for the present discussion of Jung's exploration of the depths of his own psyche. What did Jung mean? For instance, when we referred to the psyche and the unconscious. In this chapter, several of Jung's most important concepts are defined and discussed, such as the ego, the self, the unconscious, the shadow, the psyche, the persona, the soul, and the archetypes, which the purpose of making these concepts are relatable to business is used as metaphor for these concepts. Furthermore, since all these concepts consciously or unconsciously impact the way in which we behave with and think, this chapter concludes with the discussion on free will in relation to these concepts. In later chapter, the relationship between these concepts is discussed in further detail as well. Moreover, in chapter 5, 6, and 7, it is illustrated how these concepts originated from Jung's initial works, the Black Books and the Red Book. The ego. The first concept discussed is the ego. This is the easiest concept to start with because the ego is the part of ourselves with which we and those around us are most familiar. The ego is fundamentally the personality which an individual shows to the world and the personality of which he or she is consciously aware. The ego is developed through an individual's interaction with the external world. If we use a business as a metaphor, then the ego can be compared to the CEO. Similar to the CEO, the ego likes to be in control and often also naively assumed to be in full control of everything that happens. At the same time, the CEO with his business, similar to the ego with its own identity, wants to show to the world what it is acting as a cohesive unit. Jung, however, believed that the ego does not encompass the entirety of an individual's personality. Instead, the ego consists only of the conscious part of an individual's personality. This would never amount to more than a picture of the conscious personality. All those features which are unknown or unconscious to the subject would be missing. In fact, Jung proposed that these unconscious features might even be more important than the conscious features. Meanwhile, the ego is most often not even aware of the existence of these unconscious contents. As a result, these unconscious characteristics can only be revealed to the ego after carefully studying these characteristics. Hereby, it is easier for other people to identify the contents of these characteristics of another individual because they are revealed by interacting with this individual. Although most individuals might assume that their ego is the most important part of their identity, it is extremely surprising that Jung pointed to the relative unimportance of the ego. It can even be argued that the ego has not been in existence for a long time. As Newman wrote in Origins and History of Consciousness, for instance, the ego, as an independent part of our identity, has only a surprisingly brief history, since prior to its development as a separate part of the self, it was concluded within the unconscious. The mythological stages in the evolution of consciousness begin with the stage when the ego is contained in the unconscious and led up to a situation in which the ego not only becomes aware of its own position and defense is heroically, but also becomes capable of broadening and relativizing its experiences through the changes affected by its own activity. We can compare this to a business as well. Although the CEO likes to pretend that he or she is in control of the business. Its employees play a vital role as well. Combined, CEO and employees can be compared to the self, where the employees represent the unconscious part of the self. They are operating in the background but still play an extremely significant role, often more important than the CEO. Familiar to the ego. In contrast, the CEO, the ego does not listen to the employee of the business, the unconscious. Then this can result in some serious problem and the business will not function properly. The self. As such, Jung called the entirety of an individual's personality, the combination of conscious personality, the ego, and the unconscious personality, the self. As a result, Jung argued that it is almost impossible for an individual to be completely aware of all aspects of the self. Moreover, Jung argued that the ego is inferior to the self and observed that the unconscious element of the self, often unbeknown to the ego, seriously impact the behaviors of the ego. The ego is, by definition, subordinate to the self and is related to it like a part of the whole. However, luckily, not all is lost for the ego. According to Jung, it is possible for an individual to make some of the unconscious elements of the self conscious. Fundamentally, this is also what Jung himself was doing while he was writing the Black Books. Essentially, through the process of making unconscious elements conscious, one attempts to align the contents of the self to the contents of the ego. Jung would later call this process individuation. This process is discussed in detail in chapter 5. We can once again use the business metaphor as an example. By talking to his or her employees, the CEO can become aware of what is happening within the company, thereby aligning the different across within the business and forming a more cohesive unit. This increased awareness will pursued in the capability to make better decisions. The unconscious. Now that we have seen that we are largely at the mercy of our unconscious, at least as long as we have not made the unconscious conscious, it is important to define what the unconscious is. To make matter a bit more complicated, Jung further divided the unconscious between the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. On the one hand, according to Jung, the personal unconscious consists of events which have occurred in an individual's life but have not been perceived consciously. Although these events have occurred and have had a certain impact on the individual, they have, as Jung observed, only been perceived unconsciously and have therefore remained on the radar of our unconscious. However, although these events may not have been perceived consciously by the individual, they can still have an undeniably strong influence on the behaviors of an individual. In the case of our business example, this can be compared to the personal life of the employees of the company. These events impact the way in which the employee conducts his or her business without the CEO being aware of the events in the employee's personal life. For instance, if one of the employees is having a relationship problem, he or she may not communicate about this. However, at the same time, it might influence this employee's performance at work. It is only by building a good relationship with his employee's personal conscious that the CEO ego might come to understand why the employee is not performing as well as he or she did before. On the other hand, the collective unconscious is the part of the unconscious with which an individual is born. According to Jung, as a result, as opposed to the personal unconscious, the collective unconscious is not dependent upon the personal development of the individual. A more or less superficial layer of the unconscious is undoubtedly personal. I call it the personal unconscious, but this personal unconscious rests upon a deeper layer which does not derive from personal experience and is not a personal acquisition, but is inborn as opposed to the personal unconscious. Jung considered the collective unconscious to be universal because it is similar within everyone. It can be defined as a layer hidden deep within the psyche in which is present within everyone's unconscious. In the case of our business example, the collective unconscious can be compared to a certain working environment which has developed over time within a business. Although this working environment has a significant impact on the way in which the business operates, often no one is consciously aware of the existence of such an environment, and it is not easy to define when and where the development of such an environment has occurred exactly. In case the working environment is developing in the wrong direction, thereby resulting in a negative working environment, it is often only discovered when it has already become too difficult to change it. When a new employee joins the company, he or she will then often unconsciously blend into such working environment as well. Although Jung considered the unconscious to be the extreme importance, the existence of unconscious has not been accepted by everyone. Jung observed that numerous philosophers and scientists have dismissed the existence of the unconscious, both personal and collective. Jung indicated that the notion of the unconscious is often dismissed because it would suppose the existence of more than one personality. They argued naively that such an assumption implies the existence of two subjects, or, to put it in a common phrase, two personalities within the same individual. However, instead of disagreeing with such a notion, Jung claimed that this is exactly what the existence of unconscious implies. The existence of two personalities within one individual, the existence of this divided personality, is not caused by mental illness. Instead, Jung argued that each and every individual is affected by such a reality. However, at the same time, the existence of multiple personalities does not necessarily have to be an issue. As argued by Jung, it is by no means a pathological symptom. It is a normal fact that we can observe at any time and anywhere. It is not merely a neurotic whose right hand does not know what the left hand is doing. Jung believed that this situation is inherent to the existence of the unconscious. This predicament is a symptom of a general unconsciousness that is the undeniable common inheritance of all mankind. However, although we are often unaware of these unconscious forces, Jung believed that it is possible to integrate these forces, thereby making them conscious. As a result, problematic situations resulting from the existence of these multiple personalities can to some extent be avoided. Nevertheless, as Jung observed as well, this is not a one-time process. Instead, since the unconscious continues to develop as well, independent of conscious personality, this integration must be a continued process. By integrating this unconscious element, the ego and the self will be able to align themselves to another. In the business, such an integration would be comparable to a situation in which the goal and interest of the employees and the CEO are aligned. However, this must also be a never-ending process, since these goals and interests of these different actors will continue to change as well. The persona. The persona is the personality which an individual shows to the world. Although the persona can be compared to the ego in various ways, the ego encompasses the entire conscious self, whereas the persona is only a part of the ego. Moreover, as opposed to the ego, an individual often has more than one persona. The persona exists because an individual must a part in order to fit into varying environment in which he or she has to integrate. Jung defined the persona as follows: the individual's system of adaptation to, or the manner he assumes in dealing with the world. As a result, An individual can have various persona for the various ways in which he or she has to interact with the world. An individual can, for example, have one persona for work, one persona for friends, and one for family. Jung used public personalities as example in order to illustrate the significance of the persona. Jung indicated that the specific kind of behaviors is expected of these personalities by the world. As a consequence, the individual will then make sure that he or she fulfills this expectation in order to be successful in this role. This can be dangerous, however, according to Jung, because the individual might definitely too much with the persona and become him or herself convinced that this is his or her true identity, even though it is essentially not an act. The danger is that they become identical with their persona. The professor with his next book, the tenor with his voice, then the damage is done. Henceforth, the lives exclusively against the background of his own biography. As a result, Jung concluded that through the persona, the individual behaviors is influenced in a certain way, a way which is often not in line with the individual's true self. At the same time, however, the individual and those who come into contact with the individual will believe that it is the individual's true identity. One could say, with a little exaggeration, that the persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is. It can be rewarding for the individuals to be something which one is not, because it can, for instance, lead to promotions at work or new friendship. However, despite the persona hiding one's own true identity, Jung believed that after some serious examination, the individual can still discover that the persona is hiding. Whoever looks into the mirror of the water will see, first of all, his own face. Whoever goes to himself risks a confrontation with himself. The mirror does not flatter, it faithfully shows whatever looks into it, namely the face we never show to the world, because we cover it with the persona, the mask of the actor, but the mirror lies behind the mask and shows the true face. As a result, even though the persona can be useful in order to fit into and adapt to varying environment, the persona can also be dangerous because an individual might, in a way, forget his or her true self. Murray Stein, in his book Jung's Map of the Soul, questioned why the persona remained stuck to people to such a degree. According to Stein, this is partly the case because the individual, him or herself, has become familiar with his or her own persona. However, at the same time, Stein observed that shame plays a key role as well. As Stein indicated, the persona can be used to prevent a feeling of shame, a feeling which might emerge because one is ashamed of who one really. As a result, an individual can use persona to hide one's true self in order to prevent feeling ashamed of one's own true identity. Stein argued that the prevention of feeling ashamed is the main reason why the persona exists in the first place, and according to Stein, this is also the reason why the persona remains stuck to individual. A business can illustrate the meaning of the persona as well. For example, the CEO of an old company might decide to convey a message to the world that company is doing whatever it takes to become an environmentally friendly green company. By doing so, the company will be able to fit into the largest trends occurring within the world. There it becomes increasingly more important to show that one's company is not negatively impacting the environment. By adapting this persona, the company will receive numerous benefits such as new business opportunities, a better perception from the outside world, but also, quite possibly, a better opinion about himself. At the same time, if the company would not adapt this persona and shows its true face, a company which harms the environment, then the company might be shamed. However, as Jung observed, the true face will eventually reveal itself. In the example of oil company, it might be an oil spill in the nature, resulting in public outrage and shame for the company if this were to be discovered. As a result, the company will do whatever it takes to appear to the outside as something which is not. As a consequence, if environmental damage occurs as a result of the company's action, then attempts are likely made to hide this form of public as much as possible. The shadow. The shadow is the part of the self with which the individual does not like to identify itself. It can, for instance, be comprised of characteristics which society and the self consider to be unpleasant, such as jealousy, selfishness, and anger. As a result, these characteristics are suppressed by the ego through the use of persona, for instance, and hidden deep inside the unconscious. However, even though these characteristics can be hidden quite effectively, they still continue to exist. And, in a sense, they continue to live a life of their own, away from the conscious perception of the ego. Therefore, as Jung illustrated in his book Ein, it is not an easy endeavor to become conscious of the shadow. The contents of the shadow are hidden within the unconscious, and they contradict the way in which the ego likes to perceive itself. As a result, Jung argued that it requires considerable effort and sacrifice on the part of the ego in order to become conscious of the shadow. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of personality as present and real. The persona is used to mask these characteristics, and here as well, shame is an important motivator. The individual is afraid of what will happen to his or her position in society when these darker characteristics are revealed to the world. At the same time, these darker characteristics also threaten the ego's own feeling of self-worth. Interestingly, however, the individual might often project these darker characteristics of the self upon other people without realizing that these characteristics are a part of him or herself as well. In this case, both insight and good will are unveiling because the cause of the emotion appears to lie beyond all possibility of doubt in the other person. No other, how obvious it may be to the neutral, observed that it is a matter of projections. An example might be an individual who became extremely agitated when another person becomes jealous. The true reason for this agitation might be that the individual, him or herself, is unconsciously prone to jealousy but has suppressed his aspects of him or herself in order to adapt. When the individual from this example is faced with angry person, he or she faced with his own shadow and therefore reacts in an emotional manner. Using the business metaphor again, these darker characteristics can be compared to the potential blind ambition of the CEO. For example, even though the CEO does not want to admit to his or her extreme ambition, being afraid of how they might negatively impact the perception of the CEO and the entire business. This ambition still exists, and it might show itself in other ways. For instance, the CEO might break the law in order to get ahead of the competition, while hiding this from his or her employees and the public. When, however, another company breaks the law, the CEO might become seriously outraged, even though the CEO does exactly the same. Since Jung's idea of the shadow is a clear example of Jung's most interesting idea, which noticeably organized from the Black Books, it is discussed in further detail in Chapter 6. The psyche. Especially all of the concepts discussed so far together from psyche. By psyche, I understand the totality of all psychic processes, conscious as well as unconscious. Although the psyche belongs to a single individual, Jung believed that just as an individual's body, it has a long history, and the psyche, like the body, carries the marks of this history. Although the psyche of an individual only exists for a relatively short moment, the psyche itself has a long history, and historic events are still entranced deep within the psyche. It, the psyche, molds the human species, and it just as much as part of it as the human body, which, though ephemeral in the individual, it collectively of immense age. Jung observed that this might also be the reason why people are often inclined to believe in reincarnation and might sometimes be convinced to have certain memories of previously lived lives. This is also why, as already mentioned in the introduction, after delving deep into his own psyche, Jung concluded that there existed certain figures within his psyche, figures which were not created by Jung himself. Philemon was one such figure residing within Jung's psyche. Philemon and other figures of my fantasies brought home to me and crucial insight that there are things in the psyche which I do not produce, but which produce themselves and have their own life. Philemon indicated to Jung that even Jung's own thought even came from the outside, and that Jung did not have any influence on these thoughts produced by the psyche. This could perhaps also explain the origin of certain dreams of the sudden emergence of profound thought or idea. Using the business metaphor once again, the psyche represents the entirety of the business, including its CEO, its employees, and its work culture. At the same time, the business book builds upon this history of all other businesses that existed before. Although the business is therefore unique on its own, it is a part of a longer collective history, teaching far into the past, but also into the future. The soul. In essence, what Jung documented throughout the Red Book and the Black Books was an encounter with his own soul. Jung defined the soul in the Red Book, and as you can see, the soul, as Jung defined, is it quite comprehensive. I, your soul, am your mother, who tenderly and fretfully surrounds you, your nourisher and corrupter. I prepare good things and poison for you. I am your body, your shadow, your effectiveness in this world, your manifestation in the world of the gods, your effulgence, your breath, your odor, your magical force. In this sense, the soul is the source of life which fills one's psyche. Therefore, someone who lacks feeling, interests, or overall energy is often considered to be soulless, since Jung's exploration of his own soul forms the most important part of everything which he documented in the Black Books and the Red Book. The soul is discussed at greater length in the following chapters. Defining the soul of our business metaphor is a bit more complicated. Essentially, when we think of a business that lacks soul, we can consider a business that lacks energy, motivation, and the ability to innovate. Soulless business can still exist for a long time and be relatively successful. However, they do not produce anything unique, and most employees will not enjoy working for such a business unless they themselves lack soul. In Figure 1, you can see all the definitions discussed so far, the psyche on the left and the business on the right. The higher up on the arrow in the figures, the more this part is shown to the outside world, the lower on the arrow, the less this part is shown on the world. But also, the less it is shown to the conscious self without first making considerable efforts at making these parts concise. Archetypes of the collective unconscious. What are the archetypes? In this section, an overview of Jung's idea of archetypes is presented. The idea of archetypes is another notable example of an idea of which the development began with Jung's analysis of his own unconscious personality throughout the Black Books and the Red Book. After introducing this idea in these books, Jung continued to develop the idea of archetype throughout his life. As always illustrated by the example of Philemon, Jung, while actively evoking fantasies and dreams, discovered that his unconscious was filled with multiple figures. Since Jung had a deep understanding of ancient myths, cultures, and symbols, Jung discovered that there existed several similarities between the figure and the fantasies, which inhabited Jung's own unconscious, and the figure and the fantasies which were presented within the myths and symbols of our ancient ancestors. As such, Jung arrived at the conclusion that certain part of our unconscious are collective, meaning that they are already exist when an individual is born, and that they share strong communities with the unconscious of other individuals in the past, present, and future. At the same time, throughout, they might become represented in several ways. They are also similar across culture and religion. These commonalities existing within the unconscious of every individual are that Jung defined as the archetypes of the collective unconscious. Psychic existence can be recognized only by the presence of contents that are capable of consciousness, and the contents of the collective unconscious are known as archetypes. As such, the archetypes can be seen as universal images and symbols which originate from the collective unconscious and are recognizable to people without requiring any initial explanation. In this sense, similar to instinct, people are born with capacity to understand the archetypes. They are not required to be taught to someone. Different archetypes, personal, modified, and dynamic. Jung observed that the archetypes of the collective unconscious can manifest themselves in distinct forms. On the one hand, there exist archetypes which have, in a way, been more developed and have, in the sense, become a part of the conscious characteristics of a culture. They are, for instance, expressed in myths, fairy tales, and traditions. Since these archetypes have been made conscious to a certain degree, it is also easier to pass them on to future generations through these traditions. On the other hand, there exist archetypes which have a more personal nature and are more influenced by the nature of individuals' private personality. They have not been modified by culture. As a result of this individual nature, these archetypes are also a lot easier to define as compared to the modified culture archetypes. Their immediate manifestation as we encounter it is dreams and visions, which much more individual, less understandable, and more naive than in myths. For example, the archetype is essentially an unconscious contents that it is altered by becoming conscious and by being perceived, and it takes in colored from the individual consciousness in which it happens to appear. I believe that the difference can be illustrated by figure 2. On the left side, we have the personal archetypes, which differ for each individual. Although the dreams and fantasies presented by these kinds of archetype may have their origin within the collective unconscious. The personality of individuals influences the presentation of these archetypes, dreams, and fantasies. In the middle, we have modified culture archetypes. It is possible to argue that these archetypes originate from many individuals of community having similar personal archetypes. These personal archetypes may also in the development of myth and symbols, for instance. As example, they are no longer a part of the unconscious world, but have been made conscious. In case this development continues, it is possible that the modified culture archetypes develop into dogmatic archetypes, such as a religion. In the case, the archetype have become conscious to such a degree that it is not often observed that these archetypes developed from the personal unconscious. Jung observed this as well in relation to the Catholic religion. Dogma takes the place of the collective unconscious by formatting its contents on the ground scale. The Catholic way of life is completely unaware of psychological problem in this sense, because the entire life of the collective unconscious has been challenged into the dogmatic, archetypal ideas and flaws, along with all well-controlled dream in the way symbolism of creed and ritual. As such, Jung argued that the religious idea originated from symbols and images which had their origin within the collective unconscious of the individual. The idea that kingdom of God is within you would therefore be true in this sense. This individual nature of religion has, however, been forgotten by most dogmatic religion. The end of an archetype. Interestingly, as Jung observed as well, in case the archetype have become too conscious, they might end up losing their meaning altogether. As Jung indicated, archetypal symbols are extremely meaningful to such an extent that no one even considered questioning their meaning. However, as soon as human starts to question the meaning of archetype, it is possible that gods die, according to Jung, because their apparent lack of meaning is exposed, that the gods die from time to time in due man's sudden discovery that they do not mean anything, that they are made by human hands, unless idol of woods and stones. As Jung observed, If this happens, reason is the culprit, since through reason it is concluded that the archetype do not mean anything at all. Jung used the Protestant Revolution as an example. All the images and icons were destroyed because of their uselessness from the perceptive based upon reasons. As a result, we return to the circle of the left in the figure 2, where the archetype, especially in the West, are once again mostly personal and unconscious. Jung indicated, however, that individuals often still seek meaningful images and symbols, which might explain the interest in Eastern religion, for example. The Protestant is cast out into a state of defenselessness that might well make the natural man shudder. His enlightened consciousness, of course, refuses to take cognition of this fact and is quietly looking elsewhere for what has been lost in Europe. We seek the effective images, the thought forms that satisfy the restlessness of heart and mind, and we find the treasure of the East. At the same time, this might also explain why Jung's idea interests us as much as they do. They as well satisfy a certain restlessness by pointing us to the symbols and images hidden deep within the unconscious. Now that it has been discussed what an archetype is, how they evolve, and how they can eventually become meaningless through reasons, it is interesting to discuss some example of archetypes as well. For this purpose, I have selected two of the most interesting archetypes, the hero archetype and the archetypes of the god. In order to illustrate the archetype of the hero, it is extremely useful to turn to the work of Joseph Campbell. Fundamentally, Campbell has successfully built on Jung's idea of archetypes, most notably through his analysis of the hero archetype. Like Jung, Campbell noticed that throughout every hero myth existing within the world, the hero follows a similar patterns: departure, initiation, and return. A hero ventures forth from the world of common day into region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from his mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. In this way, the journey of the hero is not just a personal journey, but a universal one. Every individual can relate to the journey of the hero and does usually not question the existence of hero. At the same time, the journey of the archetypal hero is, and as indicated by Campbell, similar across culture. Even heroes in movies go through similar journeys as heroes in archetype myths. The hero from the Lord of the Rings movies, Frodo, is one of the examples. Frodo, who is at first hesitant to submit to the call to adventure, eventually, with the aid of other supernatural characters, crosses the first threshold to the other world. Frodo leaves the safe and comfortable world of the Sire and goes on adventure to Mordor. Throughout this adventure, he has to face many challenges and overcome many temptations. Eventually, Frodo returns to the shrine and he becomes a master of two worlds. If we follow the stories of heroes of ancient myths or fairy tales, they follow the familiar path as the hero of these modern movies. Joseph Campbell provided a few examples of such ancient hero myths. Prometheus ascended to the heavens, stole fire from the gods, and descended. Jason sailed through the clashing rocks into the sea of marbles, circumvented the dragon that guarded the golden fleece, and returned with the fleece and power to wrest his rightful throne from a usurper. Aeneas went down into the underworld, crossed the dreadful river of the dead, through a shop of the three-headed watchdog Cerberus, and conversed at least with the shade of his head father. As a result, whether we are dealing with the heroes present within Greek mythology, Prometheus, Jesus, and Aeneas, or heroes from the present day, movies or books, they follow the same path of departure, initiation, and return. At the same time, even though these heroic journeys are definitely not unique, they continue to resonate with us even after thousands of years, because they represent archetypal images and symbols with which we can identify. Another example of archetypes is the idea of God. As Jung observed, the idea of existence of God has already been ingrained in the psyche before the development of consciousness. As such, everyone has the pre-existing notion of what it means to believe in a God, and at the same time, every individual has the capability to believe in God. If, therefore, we speak of God as an archetype, we are saying nothing about his real nature, but are letting it be known that God already has a place in that part of our psyche which is pre-existent to consciousness. This would also explain why almost all existing cultures have developed a relation with God, albeit in different forms. These and many other examples jointed Jung to the existence of certain universal images existing deep down within the psyche of every individual, which Stein defined as more or less invariant universal fantasies and patterns of behaviors, the archetypes, in an area of deep psyche that Jung, called the collective unconscious. Do we have free will? After contemplating the effect of the existence of all these concepts developed by Jung, one might, after concluding that our conscious ego appear to play an almost inferior role compared to the various unconscious forces, wonder in how far we are capable of making our own conscious decision. Perhaps surprisingly, considering all we have discussed so far, we usually seem quite convinced that we are capable of making our own conscious rational choices. We do not question this capability, and we are quite certain that we possess something called free will. The Cambridge Dictionary describes free will as ability to decide what to do independently of any outside influence. We attach a lot of value to this notion of free will and the ability of individuals to make his or her own choices. Individual in general is often even an important topic in political debates. Usually, however, we feel that free will and individuality are threatened from the outside by external influence. We, for example, do not want our children to be exposed to certain external influence because we feel that they might influence our children's individuality. However, even though this might of course be true, after reading about Jung's ideas, one might also start to wonder how internal influences might impact our ability to make our own conscious rational choices. As we have seen, our ego, for instance, is heavily influenced by conscious and unconscious forces, such as the shadow. If we take this internal influence into account, can we still be convinced that we possess something called free will? The relationship between the ego and the self. We like to think that our ego is the dominant part of the self and therefore in control. However, as observed previously, according to Jung, this is not the case. In fact, Jung argued that it is the other way around. Inside the field of consciousness, the ego, has, as we say, free will, but just as our free will clashes with necessity in the outside world, so also it finds its limits outside the field of consciousness in the subjective inner world, where it comes into conflict with the facts of the self. Similar to events occurring in the conscious worlds which we cannot control, Jung believed that these kinds of events also happen in the internal world, outside of control of the ego. In this sense, just as hard water might hinder one from going to the beach, an internal storm might likewise hinder one from doing what he or she wants to do. Perhaps even more interesting or extremely frightening, Jung believed that the unconscious parts of the self can at any point in time completely change the ego, without the ego being able to do anything about it. It is indeed well known that the ego not only can do nothing against the self, but it sometimes actually assimilated by unconscious components of the personality that are in the process of development, is greatly altered by them. As such, besides not being entirely in control of our own conscious personality, as a result, our unconscious events which can happen at any point in time, we are not even in control of what our conscious personality even is, because it is always be altered by the unconscious force of the self. The unconscious archetypes. These unconscious forces, which can have an unimagined impact upon the ego, are observed by Jung, comprised of several archetypes, which are, as discussed previously, various sorts of images or symbols which are a part of an individual's unconscious personality. These archetypes from collective unconscious and have been passed on to an individual by his or her ancestors. One of the archetypes which has the largest impact on the ego is, according to Jung, the shadow. As already discussed earlier in this chapter, an individual's shadow consists of an individual's darker characteristics. According to Jung, the shadow can have a major impact upon emotional state of individual without the individual having much of a choice in the matter. Closer examination of dark characteristics, that is, the inferiorities constituting the shadow, reveals that they have an emotional nature, a kind of autonomy, and according to observer, or better, possessive qualities. Emotion, incidentally, is not an active of the individuals, but something that happens to him. As illustrated earlier in this chapter as well, an individual might project the characteristics of his or her shadow upon the world. Interestingly, however, this relates to our present discussion on free will as well, because this projection is a form of behaviors which occurs unconsciously. For example, an individual might curse the world because he or she believes the world is an unfair place. This individual might, however, do so because he or she is unconsciously extremely resentful. Thereby, this individual unconsciously creates an imagined world through projections without it being related to how the world really is. The effects of the projection is to isolate the subject from his environment, since instead of a real relation to it, there is now only an illusory one. Projections change the world into real replica of one's own unknown face. In the last analysis, therefore, they lead to an autoerotic or autistic condition in which one dreams a world whose reality remains forever unattainable. This is not the fault of individuals per se, because it is the result of unconscious elements existing within the psyche of individual over which individual has no control as long as these elements are not made conscious. Natural or divine. From this observation made by Jung, we can deduct that we are not always capable of making our own conscious rational choices. We have seen that our conscious ego is almost incessantly under the influence of the larger, all-encompassing self, which also contains our unconscious characteristics. Moreover, according to Jung, these unconscious characteristics are composed of several archetypes, which are a part of a larger collective unconscious, passed on us through years of development of the psyche. Jung indicated that these unconscious factors combined can not only impact one's behavior, but can completely alter one's personality. Does this then mean that we are to a large degree only a vehicle of our unconscious personalities? And might this mean that we do not possess free will? Jung observed that individuals often consult an unconscious or higher inner authority during their decision-making process. Jung believed that this higher authority can be seen as either the will of some divine authority or as unimaginable natural forces, such as our instincts. One can describe this authority either as the will of God or as an action of uncontrollable natural forces. If we define this authority as natural forces, then this might hurt our ego, because it would mean that our instincts are in control of our behaviors. If instead we see this higher authority as a divine forces, then our self-esteem remains intact, because we are merely obedient towards this divine power over which we can impossibly have any influence. Hence, we like to persuade ourselves that the matter has been decided solely by rational motion of the will. Civilized man has such a fear of a crimen lese majestatis humanae, crime of high treason, that whenever possible he indulges in a retrospective coloration of the facts in order to cover up the feeling of having suffered or moral defeat. Within this decision-making process, the inner authority, whether natural or divine, is always present according to Jung. Inner authority does need to be consulted first, as it is present at the outset. In the intensity of tendencies struggling for decision, at the same time, the individual is trying to play a role in this process as well. Jung, however, questioned to what degree the individual can influence this process. In this struggle, the individual is never a spectator only. He takes a part in it, more or less voluntarily, and tries to throw the weight of his feeling of moral freedom into the scales of decision. Nevertheless, it remains a matter of doubt how much this seemingly free decision as a casual and possibly unconscious motivation. Jung therefore observed that we might never truly come to understand to what degree the individual can influence this decision-making process. Although an individual might have the feeling of having freedom to think what he or she wants, Jung pointed out that it is not possible to know whether this feeling originates. One might wonder whether we cannot simply consciously ignore these unconscious forces. However, according to Jung, we cannot ignore the suppress these unconscious forces, because they will then only become stronger and even more dangerous and unpredictable. If suppressed for too long, Jung observed that initial harmless elements will find their way to outside world eventually, and this time they will not be as innocent as they were in the beginning. Conclusion: do we have a free will? At the beginning of this section, we have indicated that we usually take it for granted that we possess sometimes called free will. However, if we analyze the idea written down by Jung in his book Ein, we might begin to seriously question whether this is the case. Jung observed that our own conscious mind, the ego, is only the tip of the iceberg of our entire psyche. Within the entirety of our conscious and unconscious personality, the ego is arguably not the most powerful entity. Instead, we can even be argued that it is under the control of these unconscious forces, such as the shadow. Jung also indicated that there exists a hidden inner authority, whether natural or divine, which plays a vital role within the decision-making process of every individual. The individual, the ego, is then often merely a spectator within this process. Although this is a complicated topic, I believe that we can conclude that we do not possess free will in the way that is defined by Cambridge Dictionary, the ability to decide what to do independently of any outside influence. Jung made some compelling arguments indicating that the unconscious forces from the perspective of ego come from the outside, thereby making it feasible to argue that we do not possess the ability to decide what to do independently of any outside influence, i.e., we do not possess free will. In case this conclusion harms one's self-confidence too much, there is no need for too much alarm yet. Besides describing the problem, Jung gave us solution to the problem as well. We do not possess free will according to the definition used in this book, because unconscious forces come from the outside, at least from the perspective of the ego. Jung observed that we can try to assimilate these outside unconscious forces, hence making them conscious and therefore internalizing them, as indicated earlier in this chapter. This would result in an ego which is more aligned to the self. This is exactly what Jung himself did as well while he was writing down his initial fantasies and dreams in the Black Books and the Red Book. Jung called this process of initializing this unconscious forces individuation. This individuation process is discussed in detail in chapter 6, where an increasing amount of material which can be found within the Red Book and the Black Books incorporated as well in relation to the topic of individuation. Therefore, we start to analyze the contents of the Red Book and the Black Books in greater detail. It is first discussed in the following chapter why the contents of this book might be of interest at all to anyone who is not studying psychology.